For instance, the Rig Vedas in Hinduism, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Song of the Weaver, the Psalms of King David, and Homer's The Iliad are a few examples of this kind. Poetry. There are several definitions attributed in defining poetry. It is not possible to define poetry accurately in clear and final terms because, like truth and beauty, it is an abstract term. But many poets and critics have attempted to define poetry. It'll be worth to see a few definitions. Poetry is a metrical composition, according to Dr. Johnson, a great writer. Carley, the British writer and critic, says that poetry is a musical thought. In the words of Coleridge, the supreme romantic poet, he says that poetry is the expression of supreme words in supreme form. So Hudson, a historian come critic, records poetry to be uh, an explanation of life through feelings and imagination. Matthew Arnold, the great critic, considers poetry at the bottom of criticism of life. Elena Fagion attempts to define poetry in the following lines. So she defines poetry as who knows, not a rose, but the scent of a rose, not the sky, but the light in the sky, not the fly, but the gleam of the fly, not the sea, but the sound of the sea, not myself, but what makes me see, hear, and feel something that prose can't. And what it is, who knows? So, in this way, mystically, she hides what's being poetry. There are several forms of poetry you have in English literature, like ranging from short lyric to a 14-lined poem, sonnet, an epic, a very great theme based on a very great theme. For example, in English, you have The Paradise Lost, written by John Milton, free verse without any constrictions of rhyme scheme, ode addressed to anything or a person of that sort, ballad, a rural poetry, elegy, which is written upon the death of a person or even upon an animal or a bird, blank verse, so without any rhyme scheme. All these are different forms of poetry. So, for anything to be taught, there should be a primary objective. So, the primary objective of teaching poetry is to enable the students to enjoy a poem. Obviously, students will be more fascinated when they attend a poetry class to enable the pupils to read aloud the poem with proper rhythm and intonation, to enable the students to enjoy recitation, individual or chorus of the poem. That's why, for the beginners of English language, they make the children repeat the choral recitation. So, to develop a taste for poetry, reading, and writing, so after being taught a particular poet's poem, so the students should be encouraged to read the poetry on their own, other collections about the same poet, to train the emotions and feelings and imagination of the students. So it feeds their emotion and imagination. So to entertain and extend readers' imagination, so which is a very vital objective of teaching poetry. The secondary objectives of teaching poetry are as follows. It is to appreciate and derive aesthetic pleasure from the poem being taught to them, to develop the power of appreciation of beauty. So, any poem being taught, so they should be able to analyze and appreciate the beauty that the poem contains. So, that is the success of teaching poetry, to make the students understand the theme of the poem, to enable the students to analyze diction, tone, form, genre, theme, and figure of speech, to critically evaluate the poetry on their own. They should be able to evaluate the importance or significance of the poetry written, to inspire to write poetry. So it's not only enjoying poetry that matters, so they should be inspired to try their hand at writing poetry, to enable the pupils to appreciate the message of the poet conveyed in them. to appreciate the music of rhyme and rhythm, to acquaint the students with different styles of poetry, to develop emotional, aesthetic, imaginative sides of students' personality. There are twin tasks to be achieved while teaching poetry. Teaching of poetry should be seen as a participatory experience. It will not do if you just impart or how we impart knowledge. So if you teach a poetry, that will not do. So it should be a participatory experience from both ends. So students should be encouraged to compose poems. So students should be introduced to a new world of imagination. In defining poetry, two important definitions as defined by the great poets are worth mentioning here. Poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions recollected in tranquility, according to William Wordsworth, one of the pioneers of Romanticism. And Robert Frost, the great American poet, feels that poetry begins in delight and ends in wisdom. So he also feels that poetry is the highest form of literary expression. It has an aesthetic effect on human mind. It gives details and facts in a beautiful form. So you do employ some techniques while teaching poetry, but it can't be taught. The teacher can only create situations in which poem may have its fullest significance for pupils reading it. While teaching poems, the uh, teacher should appeal to the emotions of the student, not just presenting the poem as it is will do. And in a poetry class, the students must enter a different world and experience new joy. Poetry and prose. So it will be worthy for us to distinguish between poetry and prose because it makes a tremendous change. It makes a tremendous difference in teaching them. Teaching of poetry is quite different from teaching of prose. Poetry provides aesthetic pleasure to pupils and it plays a significant role in the refinement of emotions. While prose sharpens the intellect of the students, poetry enhances their flight of imagination. There are some pre-reading tasks employed with teaching poetry. It's very important to make students ready to read the poetry. We should involve them in activities which will create the right attitude and willingness to learn. We can ask some questions related to the theme of the poem based on the previous knowledge of the students. The students can guess the theme of the poem just by reading the title of the poem. So before going into the poem, just by looking at the title, and we can interact with the students to make them guess about the theme of the poem, what it can be about. Teaching poetry while reading. So, followed by the pre reading activity, we have to engage while reading what are the tasks to be accomplished. Teacher must recite the poem with full vigor and enthusiasm, using proper rhythm, pauses, and intonation. So, this will improve their reading skill, listening skill, and enable them to use the language as it is used by the native people. This helps the pupils to follow the tone and rhythm of the poem and learn the pronunciation of the words, new words, as exactly pronounced by the native speakers. The meaning of the new words and phrases should be explained by the teacher as they may create hindrance in the comprehension of the poem. The role of a teacher in teaching poetry. The teacher must bring out the beauty of the figures of speech and throw light on ideas or references involved. Imitation reading. After reading, the teacher should ask some pupils to read the poem one by one. That will be an imitation of reading so that how exactly they are able to catch the pronunciation will be seen in this task. She should help them to recite it with effect, taking care of the pronunciation and intonation. Figures of speech belonging, that is, they enhance figures of speech employed in poetry enhance expression and creativity. It creates powerful imagery, emphasize key points, add humor, wit, and evoke emotions. So there are many figures of speech employed. A few we would like to see in this presentation. Alliteration. Alliteration is the repeating of consonant sounds right next to each other, which creates a memorable melodic effect. For example, she sells seashells by the seashore. And just opposite to this is assonance, whereby repeated vowel sounds are to be seen in an expression. Antithesis. It's a literary technique that places opposite things or ideas next to one another in order to draw out their contrast. It was the best times, it was the worst times. One of the beginning line of Charles Dickens, that is in A Tale of Two Cities. Followed by you have the figure of speech hyperbole. Hyperbole is a deliberate exaggeration that adds emphasis, urgency, or excitement to a statement. For instance, if I don't eat soon, I'm going to die of hunger. It's an hyperbole. Irony. Irony is a situation that subverts a reader's expectations. One of the characters in your story is hypochondriac, always convinced that they have an exotic and uncurable disease. An ironic ending for that character would be if they died of a common cold. Metaphor. A metaphor is the direct comparison of dissimilar things to create more vivid imagery of understanding. For example, he was an onion. To understand him, she had to peel back the layers. Metonymy. Metonymy is a literary device in which a word or object stands in for a closely related word or object. Metonymy gives a writer more variability with descriptions. For example, I thought his movies were better than they weren't, so Hollywood. Onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like what it means. So when a character is exasperated, she might exclaim sheesh. So that both a word show, shows exasperation and a sound that happens when you sigh loudly. Oxymoron. Oxymoron is a phrase that uses two contradictory words to create a new meaning. For example, that strawberry cake was awfully good. Personification. Personification is assigning human attributes to non human things. For example, the floorboards groaned under the weight of each step. Pun. A pun is a form of wordplay that purposely substitutes words that sound similar but have different meanings. For instance, mine is a long and sad tale, said the mouse, turning to Alice, sighing. It is a long tale, certainly, said Alice, looking down with wonder at the mouse tail. But why do you call it sad? In Lewis Carroll's Alice Adventures in Wonderland. So we are able to see the word of pun, tail and tail. Simile. A simile compares two dissimilar things using like or as or than. The goal of a simile is to give the reader a more vivid understanding of something. For example, it was the first real day of summer, and by the time she came back indoors, she was as red as tomato. Synecdoche. A synecdoche is when a smaller unit is used to signify a larger unit and vice versa. For example, New England won the game by touchdown. Here, New England means the New England's football team. Transferred epithet. Transferred epithet is when an adjective usually used to describe a noun, this noun is transferred to an other. For example, sleepless night. We do have the post-reading comprehension. The purpose of these questions is to know if the meaning of the poem is clear to the students. So after completing the task of pre-reading and while reading the poetry, so post-reading comprehension enables the students to understand whether they understood the poem and whether they'll be able to interpret the poem and analyze the poem. They also help in making certain ideas more clear in the minds of the reader. These questions should be simple and should not break the continuity of the poem. Questions relevant to the poem should be posed. You do have appreciation questions. Appreciation questions test the appreciation of beauty of thought, images and emotions. So after all, poetry is an expression of beauty and joy. So they also let the students know more about the beauty of style and language. Poetry is experiencing joy. Poetry period must be an experience of joy. It should be a journey into another world of imagination filled with joy, a period of pondering over things they love already. Let them choose for themselves the poems they are to learn by heart, each choosing his or her own favorites. Thus, only then we can develop a taste for poetry and train their ear to a variety of beautiful sounds. So Alexander Haddow feels in the following lines, we can only rouse in them some idea of the wealth of poetry that lies before them. Remember that we must aim at turning out readers of poetry, not students of poetry. Affective fallacy. N.C. Beardsley introduced affective fallacy to describe the critical approach of evaluating a work of literature by the emotional effect it produces upon the reader. So, the emotional effect upon reading a poem, what is being produced, can be related to affective fallacy. Proponents of new criticism regard such an approach as misguided because they feel it confuses the work with its result, what it is with what it does. Also, you have something called as intentional fallacy. Winsett and Beardsley signifies what is claimed to be the error of interpreting and evaluating a literary work by reference to evidence outside the text itself for the intention, the design, and the purposes of its author. So, the objective theory holds that a literary work is separate, a thing in itself, and should not be judged by external evidences, by letters of an author, or by introductions, or by conversations. So this is intentional fallacy. So next time when we are teaching poetry in a classroom, I'm sure that you'll be able to take the students to the world of imagination and will be successful in making them appreciate the beauty of the poem with all its kind. Thank you.